During the winter, a hunter fed a pregnant bear that was dying. A year later, he heard a sound and sobbed. In the middle of Hank Bennett's existence seemed like a faraway memory in the Rocky Mountains, where wilderness reigned supreme and civilization was a thing of the past. The old wooden hut he'd constructed himself stood as a witness to his transformation into a symphony of solitude. The solid timbers of his self-imposed exile moaned softly in the winter winds that every morning when the sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and gold, it swept across the snow-covered countryside. With his breath evident in the clear mountain air, Hank would leave his refuge and prepare to face another day in his hideaways. Every morning, however, Hank's face displayed the scars of a life spent in well-planned seclusion at 55. Deep lines etched by the sun, wind, and eyes that held both were created by spending time in the elements, wisdom, and a deeper melancholy that few were ever able to see. Calloused hands and a graying beard revealed years of studying the mountain's secrets and observing its wildlife, directing sporadic visitors through its more secure areas, but the more difficult trails that headed far into the mountains. If this story piqued your curiosity, check out Hank's Untamed Wilderness, which he kept for himself. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you are viewing from. Let's go on. Like all mornings, this one began with Hank inspecting his equipment and getting ready for a day of deer tracking. Despite the new snow, the winter had been exceptionally severe, forcing many mountain residents to move closer to the lower altitudes in pursuit of sustenance, while pursuing a series of encouraging trails. The only sounds in the forest were the gentle crunch of his boots on the snow and the occasional crunch of wind. The tracking took him to a familiar area that he had passed through the pine branches hundreds of times previously, but today was unique since he got closer to his trained eyes. Something big and brown against the snow's immaculate white attracted Hank's attention as he proceeded toward the tree line. When he saw the shape of a young female grizzly bear lying in the snow, his heart began to race. Hank was struck by the strong body, displaying marks of hunger and tiredness that were evident to his seasoned eyes. Although the bear's bodily ailments were worrisome enough, the most were her eyes' deep pools of purity. The brilliance and desperation in Amber's eyes spoke to something deep within of him. As the bear regarded him, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness and struggle against the elements and life itself. Tired but made no attempt to run away or attack, a behavior that both caught his attention and alarmed him. Drawing on decades of expertise, he could see that his tactics might work for just a moment, but he knew from his forest expertise that he should gradually retreat and let the bear fight for herself, because nature has hers. Although his own approach to these circumstances in meddling rarely produced favorable results, something kept him in position. Perhaps it was the way she gazed at him that anchored them to the area as firmly as the old pines that encircled them. Perhaps it was a calling he couldn't quite comprehend, but he felt driven to respond with gestures, so Hank reached into his jacket pocket where he stored his emergency provisions, and his fingers moved slowly, scarcely noticeable, wrapped around a piece of dried venison that he had prepared using all of his instincts, which he had developed during years of living in the wilderness. Begged him to leave, but his heart, the part of him he had worked so hard to keep quiet over the years, pushed him to do so. His voice was harsh from not using the bear's ears, so he murmured, "Come on, easy there, girl." Hank took a cautious step forward as she trembled at the sound, but stayed motionless, observing him with those keen eyes. The bear's nose expanded as he smelled the meat that was being held out in front of him like an offering. As he watched her devour the food that was served, Hank felt something change inside of him. Her head was slightly raised off the snow. He found himself thinking of her as Rose at the beginning of spring, like the first fisher in a frozen lake, coming to him without permission, maybe as a result of her brown fur's subtle scarlet hue when the sun strikes it just right. He hadn't named anything in years, and he hadn't let himself care for someone else in years. The encounter barely lasted a few minutes, but when Hank returned to his lair that night, he was aware that something basic had altered the barriers of isolation he had erected around himself. As he sat by his fireplace that night, It seemed suddenly less solid and unnecessary. He found himself contemplating Rose as the flames created dancing shadows on the cottage walls, wondering if she felt it. Against his better judgment, he found shelter from the biting cold the following morning. Hank convinced himself he was only going to check on her and put extra supplies in his rucksack. He was overcome with a sense of eagerness as soon as he stepped outside into the clear morning air. It excited and frightened him a little, something he hadn't done in years. Did Hank realize that this small deed of compassion, this encounter with a wild animal, would initiate a sequence of events that would not only contradict his preconceived notions about wilderness survival, but would also compel him to confront the primary reasons he had first decided to live a solitary life? The mountain appeared to pause its breath as he made his way back to the clearing, following his footprints from the day before, anticipating what would happen between the frantic bear and the lonely guy who had somehow connected in the forested desert. The days that followed amid the wide wilderness signaled a little but significant shift in Tahoe. Every morning, Hank's meticulously planned world drew him back to the clearing, his pace growing as he ate. Rose came toward him, his pulse pounding with a mix of worry and excitement. Stayed nearby, and Hank discovered something that made him gasp as he watched her from a safe distance. Hitch in his throat. She was pregnant. Her careful, sluggish movements revealed the telltale indicators of distress. The revelation of impending motherhood roused something inside Hank that he believed had been buried for years. With the protective instinct that went beyond simple empathy, he started observing her habits and how she found it difficult to find adequate food in the snow-covered terrain. The hard winter had forced many of the smaller victims to escape by dying decaying. Without proper nourishment, her odds of surviving the pregnancy, let alone caring, would be reduced by the creatures she would normally hunt. "You're not making this easy for me, are you, girl Hank?" For her, the cubs were thin, murmured one morning as Rose tried to search for roots in the cold ground. The sight of her, resolve in spite of her compromised state, evoked memories he had long repressed, of he left behind relationships and another life of responsibility. Shook his head in an attempt to get the thoughts out of his head, but they stuck to him, like ice on pine needles. Using the animal management principles he had acquired over the years, Hank started getting ready for what he anticipated to be about a year in Japan. After a difficult few months, he began smoking fish he caught from the cold storage in his cabin and keeping additional meat. Every time he brought food, he collected whatever edible flora he could find beneath the snow in a partially frozen stream. He kept a cautious distance from Rose, honoring the delicate equilibrium between support and intervention. The harsh winter showed no signs of abating. As Hank watched, storm after storm blasted through the mountains, covering the area in new layers of snow. Rose's struggles to find suitable shelter in the natural caves caused her to become increasingly concerned. All the local dens were either overly exposed to the weather or had already been occupied by other wildlife following a recent storm. During a particularly bad blizzard, he made a choice that would change their lives forever. By utilizing his understanding of outdoor survival, Hank started building Rose a temporary shelter by collecting half-broken roots from his own cabin and used fallen branches to weave them together to form a strong foundation. After finally anchoring her with a spread of horse blankets he estimated it would cost $30 to place, things he'd put aside and almost forgotten about the shelter, such as blankets and tops, gradually took shape. Away from "not much," he answered, but it's situated to shield its occupants from the harsh mountain winds and the main trails. Rose watched as he gently stepped back to examine his job. "But it should keep you warm." Her perceptive eyes followed his every step as he finished the shelter, and they were trusted, had developed gradually but steadily, much like a seedling establishing itself in stony ground. When he approached, longer displayed indications of worry. But Hank never took this approval for granted. Because the weeks passed quickly and without any help from his friends, Hank noticed that he spoke to Rose more often, his voice getting stronger with use. He told her tales of his earlier forays into the highlands, the alterations he had witnessed over time, and occasionally When he was very vulnerable due to the losses that had led him to live alone, Rose would listen to him with intense eyes that made him question whether she somehow recognized the gravity of his struggles. Few people failed to observe Hank's change as a result of his statements. Some had felt drawn to him, involved him in their emotions, and believed in what he was doing. When he occasionally went into town to get supplies, the store owner's wife made a remark about the decline of the sales. But here, he had missed one part of his original plan. With a light step and a fresh gleam in his eyes, Hank sidestepped their scrutiny with evasive grunts. However, in private, he was unable to ignore the transformation within himself. The wall of seclusion he had constructed around his heart. One evening, as the sun dropped, he noticed cracks allowing pinpricks of light that he had assumed he would never see again. Hank sat in his normal location next to Rose's shelter, painting the snow in pink and gold hues behind the mountains. Keeping the respectable distance they had established, the sky was clear, but the air was chilly. As he saw Rose getting comfortable in her shelter, he saw that her breathing had become more cautiously during labor, and it was obvious that she would give delivery. Soon after, the realization made him feel both excited and dreadful. That was always risky in the forest, and the current winter had just made things worse. Difficult Hank was aware that the coming days would be crucial for him, as well as Rose and her cubs. Went too far in deciding to assist her, and as he returned to his cabin, there was no going back. Hank felt the weight of his choice settling about him as the stars in the night sky began to emerge like diamonds, his shoulders like a comfortable blanket, unaware that the true difficulties were still to come. The arrival of his dedication to keeping children safe would be put to the test when Rose's cubs started a chain of events that would additionally make him face the reasons he'd first decided to live a solitary life. As he readied himself for Hank, couldn't get rid of the feeling, despite gathering more supplies and strengthening the shelter in anticipation of the arrival, that the night the cubs were born was a strong reminder that his life was going to change in ways he couldn't have predicted. As though nature itself were emphasizing the importance of the minute, Hank had been there. A blizzard roared through the mountains. Footnote: he paced his cabin floor restlessly all evening, listening to the wind howling and, something in the air, possibly the same instinct that had worked so effectively for him as he watched the snow build up against his windows, informed him that, in spite of the perilous circumstances, this was the night he should grab his emergency gear and went out into the storm, where the wind sliced through his bulky coat like snow and freezing daggers. The flashlight beams seared his bare face as it was forced horizontal by the gale, forged a small trail through the shadows to reach Rose's refuge, his feet discovering the well-known route, even with almost no vision. And, as he got closer to the shelter, he heard noises that supported his suspicion that as Rose gave delivery, Hank took a seat at the sound of her low, laborious growls. Hours went by at a safe distance that was both close enough to allow for intervention if needed and far enough to prevent any tension. Rose gave them fresh life while he kept watch over the tempest roaring all around them. By dawn, the storm had passed, and 3 small cubs had joined the world. Hank marveled at the world as Rose lovingly cared for her infants, keeping them warm and clean against her body. The smallest of the 3 was notably less powerful than its. He was particularly drawn to the siblings' tenacious attempts to feel their mother's love. Caused Hank to feel intense emotions, and that's it, Tiny Tommy, he muttered the name. As he observed the tiniest cub, it came to him naturally. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said, silently naming the other 2 cubs. In his mind, the female Essie stars with a characteristic white patch on her chest, and the bigger male became Buck. Even in these early days, each so-called star had a distinct personality that developed over the next few weeks. Hank extended his visits and brought extra food, demonstrating a delicate dance of prudence and care. He learned to read the small fluctuations in Rose's strength, which she needed to sustain in order to nurse the cubs. Their relationship grew stronger as a result of her actions when she accepted his presence and when she sought space. Mutual regard and comprehension passed along a bunch of information. First identifying Tommy after the tiniest cub kept grabbing Hank's interest, while his siblings got stronger every day. But Hank's improvement was more methodical, while Tommy's was slower. Saw a reflection of himself in the young cub's tenacity, and became especially engaged in their survival. Facing hardship, he started to spend more time watching the family, recording all of the cub's developmental milestones in a worn journal. As winter started to ease its hold on the mountains, new difficulties surfaced. Increased activity in the region due to the warming weather, and the first indications of Hank observed more people on the faraway trails during the next tourist season, and occasionally heard cars on the Forest Service roads. Each encroachment into the tranquil Hacier, he experienced a surge of fear one morning as he approached the shelter with his customary Tei. Now his first greyhound friends, he hadn't provided them without asking, and was at least one of the prank Russians who sought to kill him, Neil offering. When Hank noticed new boot prints in the melting snow that weren't his own, he froze. Been nearby enough to possibly find Rose and her cubs, the realization came to him like a physical shock. The revelation revealed that his newfound family's tranquil bubble was more brittle than he had anticipated, made Hank more watchful, and he started creating false trails to get away, parted the shelter, and as his protective instincts were reawakened, he adopted more intricate ways to avoid being followed. The repulsion was what fueled Peter's self-improvement, and at the same time gave him the courage to achieve more than he ever had before. Motivated him to go over and above to protect Rose and her cubs. Every day brought fresh concerns, such as the distant helicopter's sound, a dog's bark on a hiking trail, or a glimpse of a cub's reflecting sunlight. Buck showed early indications of his mother's power as he grew and explored their small environment, frequently leading his fellow young ones in light-hearted wrestling matches. The star was often the first to try out new noises, but perhaps unexpectedly or since. While Tommy, although being the smallest, showed an unexpected Hank's resourcefulness in figuring out how to stay up with his more resilient brothers, led him to spend more time at the refuge rather than in his own cabin. Disregarding his former solitary routine in the face of his new tasks, he started to observe minor changes in himself, such as how he spoke out loud and smiled more frequently. He surrounded himself with a wall of solitude, sharing his thoughts with Rose as though she could comprehend every word. One afternoon, while watching the cubs, he kept breaking things down, brick by brick. While falling in a spot of spring sunshine, Hank heard his name being called by a familiar voice, coming from the main. Mike Reynolds, the local conservationist, was the one who almost stopped his heart. Officer, and among the few individuals Hank had thought of as friends in his former life. The sound acted as a harsh reminder that his tranquil life with Rose and her cubs was only possible because of the stolen time that the outer world was approaching, and he would soon have to make choices that would impact not just his life, but also the bears' lives. As Mike's voice got closer, Hank immediately realized how much he had grown to care for his belongings, apologized to Rose in private, and proceeded to stop his old acquaintance. The quiet seclusion of winter was coming to an end before he could find the refuge, and with it, Hank's straightforward clarity. The actual difficulties in his quest to safeguard his adopted family were only getting started, and they would put to the test both his inventiveness and his comprehension of the boundaries between the wild and the human. Actually, that afternoon's encounter with Mike on the trail signaled the start of a new experience. An old acquaintance of Hank's appeared in front of him during a difficult moment, looking his green Conservation Service outfit with its immaculately pressed insignia glinting was essentially the same as it had been years before. In the springtime brightness, yet Mike's eyes had a strain that was different from what it had been previously. Striked away some extra batteries and turned the television back on. "It's been a while since anyone has seen you around town," Hank Mike replied, holding out his hand. The attempt at that comedy failed, and some people began to question whether you had permanently become a hermit. Mike's voice had an underlying worry that Hank couldn't help but notice, so he forced a smile, painfully conscious of their proximity to Rose's refuge. "You are aware of my preference, Mike, the companionship of trees to people most days." He purposefully stood in such a way as to obstruct the bear's passage. Mike stated, "I'm here because I'm hoping that his old friend won't notice the nervousness in his stance." Inside, expression becoming more severe, "We've been hearing of increased activity in the area compared to normal for this period of time. He stopped studying because several of the local farmers are becoming anxious this year, especially as carving season approaches." The question hovered between them, and Hank's look said, "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Laden with implication, Hank's heart rate increased, but he maintained a neutral demeanor. "Bears are a part of," Mike pointed to the nearby forest and said, "these mountains have always been better than most." Mike sighed, taking off his service cap and stroking his graying hair. "Is their home too, Hank?" The tourism board is advocating for additional paths in this region and is considering enlarging the periphery of the parking lot. Farmers are already worrying about predators, so perhaps some picturesque pathways or even viewing platforms could be added. Control. And, now that these additional occurrences had occurred, he left the ramifications unsaid. Hank was slammed with the news. Similar to a physical assault, more trails meant more individuals, more disruption, and greater danger. Tommy was still so little and defenseless, and he felt a connection to Rose and her cubs. Outbursts of protective rage because Wilderness Mike is protected and they can't, Mike said softly. Just come in and build whatever they want. They can with the right permits. They're getting... Look, Hank, I understand you have good reasons for staying up here. I've respected that. But lately I've noticed a change in you. You're purchasing more supplies than normal, according to the store owners, and some hikers have seen you establishing what seems to be false trails. He hesitated, carefully selecting his next words. And if you're involved, take caution. I must know the moment that spanned years of time between them if you're attempting to defend something. Friendship with Hanks need to keep his secret. He eventually revealed his mic. Sometimes it's best to let the mountains be their own way. Speak quietly and calmly. Before Mike could react, they heard the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air. As soon as he heard the sound of a survey helicopter, the mountain air, Hank's heart leaped into his throat. Mike promised to come soon after the discussion concluded, having brought up one of the development plans he had discussed. Hank realized the tranquil life he had established was under threat as he watched his companion vanish down the trail. He had to take immediate action to safeguard Rose and her from the danger that the outer world was posing from all directions. Hank put himself into preparation over the next 4 days, spending hours with the cubs, looking at maps of the surrounding wilderness to find potential safer places for the bears. Knowing that any move would need to be meticulously planned and carried out, he started to accumulate supplies because the cubs were still unsaddled and stuck. As he watched Rose, he was concerned about more than just the physical difficulties. Even though he was young and any journey would be dangerous, her cubs were being taught to forage, and Buck is being tested for strength against fallen logs. Tommy's ingenious discovery of each new scent and his unwavering curiosity strategies to stay up with his brothers, Hank became aware of how interwoven his life had become with theirs. The idea of the sun became overwhelming to watch one obliterated. As they slept, the sun was broken. One evening, it was nearly intolerable to lose them, because you had failed to protect them. The sky was painted in vivid oranges and purples as the sun sank behind the mountains. While Hank was sitting close to the shelter, taking notes in his journal, the cubs were playing nearby, tumbling and growling. Despite his concerns, Rose made him smile by watching her children with protective pride and occasionally looking at Hank with the serene image that he had learned to call trust in her eyes. Was cut off by the far-off voices of hikers who had deviated from the main path, Hank hastily collected his following things. When he realized Tommy had strayed farther from the shelter than expected, he had everything prepared to provide a distraction if needed. The little cub, as always intrigued by the unfamiliar noises, stood at the edge of a little ridge, was not aware of the possible threat as the voices got closer, and that Hank decided he couldn't wait any longer after seeing Tommy's defenseless figure silhouetted against the sunset. It was time to relocate Rose and her cubs to a more secure location farther into the forest. But as he started to devise his strategy, he had no way of knowing that his choice would start a series of events that ultimately impact all of his life. The morning Hank made the decision to question everything he believed to be true about friendship, survival, and the value of family. It was a clear and fresh day to start looking for a new place, with the kind of pure mountain air that made every hope force him to hope. Cam started his expedition by poring over topographical charts, identifying possible locations for the faraway peak that appeared to be within arm's reach. Routes and safe havens, his thoughts are constantly buzzing with potential threats and hopes. As he labored to match the deepening shadows, the soft light from his oil lamp created long shadows on the cabin walls. As he packed his survey equipment and set out, he thought, rising before dawn. The first indications of spring were everywhere, with fragile buds pushing through, so Rose and her cubs had more food. The sounds of returning birds, the melting of snow, and the slow greening of the mountain slopes beneath various situations. Now, every indication of the approaching season felt like a countdown, when Hank would have relished these changes. As his investigation led him farther into the wilderness than he had been in years, he meticulously marked his trail and making thorough notes about the train's possible food supplies, natural shelters, and water sources became more difficult as he advanced more into the backcountry, away from any designated trails or human presence. Hank found a hidden valley that appeared promising when he ascended a particularly steep ridge. The region was rich, with a fine stream meandering through it and numerous natural caverns scattered among the nearby cliffs. There were plenty of indications of small game and berry bushes that will bear fruit in the upcoming months. But most significantly, it was far from any tourist attractions or planned development. But if you got Roe and 3 baby cubs there, that would be the true obstacle. The trip would require them to cover bare ground, pass into regions that other predators frequent, and over challenges that would put even an adult bear to the test. Hank considered Tom the tiniest cub, and his heart tightened in anxiety as he made his way back to the shelter that Hank discovered Rose's unusually anxious behavior in the afternoon. And it quickly put him on guard. And it was quickly determined what was causing the new boot prints in the dirt next to the shelter. The silvery gleam of a wildlife camera attached to a neighboring tree with trembling was something that chilled him to the bone. Hank took out the camera, which was a high-end model similar to the ones used by someone with expertise in wildlife photography or study had been keeping an eye on the region. And from the camera's angle, the ramifications struck when they realized the camera's location regarding Rose and her cubs. That night, as he sat in his cabin, going over the day's events, he realized that their secret was no longer safe. He writes that he almost jumped out of his skin when he heard Mike knock on his door unexpectedly, and this time he wasn't by himself. A woman wearing a sharp business suit stood next to him, holding her tablet computer firmly against her chest. "Hank, this is Sarah Chen from the Wildlife," Mike remarked solemnly. "Conservation board, the woman moved out to offer to talk to you about some observations in the neighborhood. Mr. Bennett, we've been keeping an eye out for any odd bear activity in this region. Our data indicates that a mother, cubs, and many sources are present. Have suggested that you may know where they are." Hank's thoughts were racing as he invited them inside. Cautious to maintain a neutral expression, the cabin felt suddenly too small as well. Chen started laying out, feeling confined as though the walls were closing in on him. Using data charts and satellite photographs on his crude hewn table, he discovered the situation was much more complicated than he had expected. She indicated, pointing to thermal imaging, that she thought the board was very interested in this family group. Images that unmistakably depicted Rose and her cubs close to the shelter offered a special chance for our conservation efforts. Studies. These bears would be ideal participants for the extensive research project we're getting ready to start. The phrase, research project, made Hank shiver, because he understood what it meant: tracking collars, routine observation, ongoing human intervention, and everything else. He wondered what this research would entail, as he had been attempting to shield Rose and her cubs from maintaining his composure. Miss Chen's excitement was clear as she described the project: a group of researchers routine data collecting, observations, and, most concerning of all, plans to tag and track the bears for tracking, as though it were a gift and a chance to promote conservation, but all. The meeting marked the end of the tranquil life that Hank had helped Rose and her family lead. As they went on, Hank saw Mike observing him intently, gauging the strain in his shoulders by the way his fists gripped, and his old acquaintance was seated beneath the table, and knew him well enough to understand his anguish, but it was unclear which side he was supporting. Would Mike decide when the time came? The discussion continued long into the night, and every minute that went by, Hank's determination grew stronger as he realized that transferring the bears was now not just a possibility, but also a must. As he bids his surprised guests farewell and watches their car vanish down the mountain road, a new wildlife conservation board had resources, authority, and technology on their side, so he wasn't worried. Moving Rose and her cubs would require staying one step ahead of the wilderness's inherent obstacles. That night and a half before, those who would follow them for the sake of science. Through his cabin window, the moon created silver shadows, and Hank started getting ready for what he knew would be the most difficult voyage of his life. The period for meticulous preparation was ended. They had to relocate quickly, but first he had to determine how to turn off that wildlife camera without drawing attention to yourself, and, more significantly, how to prevent others from following them, as dawn was just beginning to break when they eventually fled into the deeper wilderness. Handling the wildlife camera was the first task Hank had to complete as he started carrying out his plan. After a restless night of thought, he had devised a plan that he believed would buy them some time without causing any instant suspicion. He gently moved the camera to focus on an area he knew was home to wildlife, location that is frequently visited by deer and elk, giving the impression that the tree's natural movements were the reason for the adjustment. In order to prepare Rose and her cubs for the bears' upcoming voyage, the following test was far more difficult. The cubs, in particular, who had become accustomed to the safety of their home and the surroundings, had to gradually improve their stamina and strength for long-distance travel. He started by enlarging their feeding area and arranging food strategically, being wary of any onlookers. Rose appeared to sense that the family was being encouraged to travel farther each day as they got farther away from the shelter. Buck and Star gladly followed their mother's instructions, rapidly adjusting to the new regiment. But Tommy's advancement worried Hank, the tiniest cub, who continued to struggle, with Hank whispered, "Come on, little one," as he frequently fell behind his siblings in distance. Seeing Tommy resolutely climb a difficult slope gives you hope that you have more strength than any of them know. But when the cub eventually made it to the top, his heart grew with pride, thanks to a cunning zigzag design that made the climb easier. The quiet setting was broken by the sound of an approaching chopper. Hank swiftly led Rose and the cubs. His heart was racing as the plane flew over the security cameras, as they simulated going to a hidden location. Later that afternoon, planes had increased in frequency, and each one made their predicament more urgent. As Hank checked his backup trails, he came across new boot prints that chilled him to the bone. These weren't the meticulous footprints of researchers or conservation authorities, which included the thick marks of hunting boots and collaring bones in their wake. Even though the season was over, some residents had started performing their own surveillance because they were worried about bears being so near their properties. When Hank got back to his cabin that night, he discovered a message from Mike on his Satellihide phone. This was the only way to hook up-to-date emergency equipment, and the Wildlife Conservation Board was expediting its plans, would be arriving within the week to start their research project fully equipped with a team. Made Hank modify his schedule because they had to relocate and couldn't wait for the cubs to gain additional strength. That evening, he created mini transportable food packages and packed his emergency supplies. The following morning, his years of expertise as a wilderness guide will be put to the ultimate test when an unexpected problem. A group of hikers had strayed from the main path, and their voices could be heard clearly in the clear mountain air. As they got closer to Rose's refuge, Hank noticed a sudden quiet while Rose hurriedly gathered her cubs, leading them to the hiding place they had practiced. but Tommy was sidetracked by a butterfly and failed to see him. As soon as one of the hikers held out a camera and pointed it in Tommy's direction, Hank's heart almost stopped. Unthinkingly, he emerged from his hiding place and purposefully made noise to attract attention to himself. "This area is completely private property, and you shall not enter," he yelled, in his best commanding voice, that it was closed for the safety of wildlife. "You must go back to the designated trail," because the hikers were taken aback by his abrupt. Hank hurriedly apologized and turned around, waiting for them to recover. Tommy had eventually joined his family in their hiding place before Hank checked on the bears, but the near miss left Hank as he made his last preparations that evening. He was shaken because they had almost lost everything due to a butterfly. Seen something that made their predicament even more complicated? Rose's behavior had changed slightly, was more watchful and protective, and years of studying wildlife informed him that this indicated the presence of another bear in the neighborhood. Rose's presence is likely to attract a male bear. Although a male bear would typically be a natural defender for a bear, in their current circumstance, the family group's already complicated equation gained an unforeseen component if the male was angry or possessive, which can compel Rose to run in an unexpected direction, possibly directly into the places they lamplight Hank traced his maps one last time, which they were attempting to avoid reviewing. The escape path he had selected would lead them across some of the most difficult terrain in the area. However, it was also the least likely route to be seen or followed. They would have to cross 2 streams and make their way through a succession of mountains. Before arriving at the relative safety of the hidden valley, he had to cross a high mountain pass and a series of rocky ridges. Discovering his equipment and rolling up the maps, Hank heard the smallish yelling that appeared to be coming from the valley. As the day was coming to an end, there was a louder than normal distant sound of cars on the Forest Service road. They would have to start their journey before dawn tomorrow. Everything would rely on the following few hours, and Hank could only pray that his preparation would be sufficient as he ventured out into the gathering dusk to conduct his last inspections. The world was still covered in pre-dawn darkness when Hank had enough light to see them all safely through what was ahead. Hank started the most important part of his strategy by strolling into the woodland in silence, his breath apparent in the chilly morning air. He deliberately created a number of false trails that led off the path that would ultimately need years of exploration. Experience had taught him how to conceal his genuine destination talents while creating realistic tracks, which he had never thought possible. His first goal when utilizing anything like this was to create a distraction that would buy him the Curo, using the meticulously kept naked fur he had gathered from Rose's refuge and placed it. He produced evidence of the naked family traveling northeast toward a well-known wildlife area by placing old tracks. For a mother bear looking for fresh territory, the corridor would be the natural choice. Clear enough to deflect attention. When Hank arrived at Rose's shelter for what he knew would be their genuine journey, the sky was just starting to brighten. Rose's intuition told her that something was different the last time the bear family was already awake. Observing their mother's attentiveness, the cubs were particularly calm this morning, even little Tommy, who always greeted Hank with enthusiastic gestures. "This is it, girl," Hank muttered. He started lying, his voice raspy with emotion. "Time to trust me again," distributing little amounts of high-energy foods, such as dried meat and fish, to make a trail that would guide them to their escape. Route Rose kept a close eye on him, her perceptive gaze tracking his every step, as though she recognized how crucial it was to be. As they started their journey, the first significant obstacle they faced was having to cross an exposed ridge. Remaining concealed from the valley underneath, where the Forest Service road meandered through the mountains, the timing had to be ideal. Early enough to miss the helicopter surveys that were conducted every day, yet late enough to miss the perpetual shadows for cover. Rose patiently guided her cubs. Buck and Star remained with their mother after Hank's meticulously planned path, but Tommy had trouble with. Every time the tiniest cub stumbled or fell behind on the steep terrain, Hank's heart tightened. But the little bear showed unexpected fortitude in coming up with innovative solutions to the challenging journey. Their pace was excruciatingly sluggish, What Hank would have done alone in a few hours turned into a cautious day-long journey with every sound the bears made. A far-off engine, a breaking branch, a bird's call, caused the cubs, who were not used to such prolonged travel, should be frozen and covered. Hank used to scout ahead and look for any indications of frequent rest stops. Nevertheless, the sun had fully risen by mid-morning, and the heat was starting to take its toll. The cubs, Tommy in particular, displayed signs of exhaustion after reaching a particularly difficult area with a steep incline. As they started their ascent up an old rocky slope with no protection, the distant sound of rotor blades reverberated through the valley. With his pulse racing, Hank led the bear family swiftly into a natural hollow beneath an outcropping. He could see the helicopter following the fake trail he had made as it drew nearer from where they were hiding. OQP was undoubtedly using powerful cameras and thermal imaging equipment to scan the ground below as the helicopter flew by. Hank was startled by the near miss, but they needed to move more quickly because the cubs were already pushing their boundaries. He saw their tiny bodies nestled against their mother and knew he would need to change his plan. They needed a different route, even if it meant a longer journey, because the one he had originally planned was too exposed. As the test day went on, other issues surfaced, and the distant sound of dogs barking indicated that ground crews had started to explore the area. And, to make matters worse, Hank found new bear tracks that weren't Rose's or hers. Cubs. The male bear was pursuing them. Its presence made their already dangerous situation even more unpredictable. Searching for a hook for their missing leader, they had to cross a crucial juncture in their journey, and they had to cross once again before they were given destinations to scavenge and feed their families. They had to cross a tiny pass between two peaks before midnight, and it provided their best opportunity to losing any chasers. But the rain was dangerous, particularly for the little cubs, as they got closer to the storm clouds started to assemble above the mountains, posing a threat to make their escape even more challenging. Hank researched. The sky was getting darker, and there was increasing fear that a storm would make the pass even more hazardous, but going back wasn't an option. Alternative, and as thunder roared in, they were now committed, for better or worse. The distance he gazed at Rose and her cubs, especially at Tommy, who remained resolute in spite of his weariness, shine in his eyes. "We'll get through this," Hank said quietly, but he was uncertain if he was comforting the bears or himself, because the wind was increasing and bringing the first few drops of rain was falling behind them, and the sounds of the search dogs were getting a little louder. As they started, the small pass awaited their entryway, to either safety or catastrophe. Hank couldn't get the idea that the following few hours would put them all to the test in ways they was unable to comprehend, that the storm was approaching, daylight was waning, and somewhere behind, they had just started their journey, and many search teams were closing in. Already, it was becoming more difficult than he had anticipated, and the storm struck with full force as they arrived at the tiny pass's entrance. Wind roared through the stony corridor, carrying stinging rain, and visibility drastically decreased during sporadic hailstorms, forcing Hank to rely more on his in-depth understanding of the landscape than he could see. And the bears advanced warily behind him, Rose maintaining. As they made their way down the perilous slope, her cubs closed as lightning flared overhead, illuminating the sheer cliff, walls on each side of them, and during those fleeting periods of intense illumination, Hank could see the difficulty that awaited him. About halfway through, the path became much more narrow, with a particularly dangerous stretch when the route hugged. Under normal circumstances, the cliff face would be hazardous, but during this storm, it was almost impossible. "Now," Hank called out over the wind, more for his own comfort than for anything else. With incredible faith in her strong form, the bear's Rose followed his lead, while Buck and Star remained with their mother to protect her cubs from the harshest weather. Tommy had difficulties. Despite the strong winds that may have thrown his tiny body off balance, they were halfway through the path when calamity occurred. A strong lightning bolt struck somewhere above them. Hank turned just as Tommy lost his footing, unleashing a rain of boulders and debris down the cliff wall. Without thinking, he slid toward the path's edge and sprang forward, forming a barrier with his walking stick. It halted the cub's decline. Rose growled in concern, but was unable to go to Tommy without endangering her fellow cubs. For a terrible moment, everything hung in balance in the small area. Tommy rose, split between her cubs and Hank, strained to get his bearings. Tommy was able to quickly bring himself back to safety. Hank's pulse was racing as he pressed close to his mother, but they were unable to stop the storm from getting stronger. And even though the wind was muffled, the noises of searching dogs could still be heard in the distance when they came out of the other side. The path ahead led down into a valley that Hank had previously intended to cross, so his relief on the other side of the pass was fleeting, completing their last climb to escape. But the storm had turned the normally controllable terrain into a dangerous muck and loose rock slope, and far worse, the valley's creek had swelled from the rain, becoming a mighty spring of blood flow to the valley that hadn't been there for decades. They needed a somewhere to be safe during the storm's harshest parts, and Hank knew of a cave system close by, one that he had plotted years prior, but he hardly ever went to because of its isolated location, which required them to stray from their chosen route. But the alternative was to run the risk of getting hurt, or worse, on the hills that were drenched with rain. When a huge figure on the ridge above the male bear was illuminated by another lightning strike, a decision was made for them. It had located them, and its brilliant silhouette against the stormy sky was Bokler. Fearsome Rose put herself between the Malay and her cubs right away, but under these circumstances a fight may be lethal for all those concerned, Hank advised. Guiding them toward the cave's presence in the cave system actually benefited them because its traces would never be mistaken again. They moved as fast as they dared through the pouring rain, confusing any onlookers, and the cubs were having trouble keeping up. The entrance to the cave was partially obscured by a curtain of water flowing off as the muddy conditions increased. Hank entered the rocks above first, using his torch to look for other people, but it was empty. He led the cave was deeper than he remembered, and Rose and her cubs were within, with several others. The sound of the storm was muffled in the chambers that led away from the entryway, producing a nearly tranquil ambiance. Hank hurried to clear the area in contrast to the mayhem outside. As the bears took up residence in one of the larger chambers, rain would help hide any obvious traces of their arrival, but he couldn't take the chance of being irresponsible. The bear's footprints were all over the place, making it difficult for any tracking dogs to find him. But Hank was certain that their pursuers would have access to more than simply dogs in the cave's relative safety. Hank was able to find the cave. The cubs were worn out by his charges, but Tommy was uninjured, despite his clothes, remained awake yet composed, seemingly believing their temporary sanctuary, using the time to organize their next course of action as Hank distributed part of their running food supplies. Although a storm might buy them some time, it also meant that the terrain would be significantly more difficult for them to go forward. It would be difficult to cross the flooded stream, and climbing would be dangerous due to the muddy hills. As darkness fell outside the cave where Hank confined them, they needed to relax, but couldn't afford to remain there for too long. Guard near the entrance, listening to the fury of the storm, while the valley below was occasionally lighted by a flash of lightning, and during one of these flashes he saw something that chilled him. Far-off lights flickering through. An instant the lights seemed to circle around him. The trees are too intentional and stable to be anything else than search trees. Although the storm had given them some time, they would face fresh difficulties tomorrow, including navigating not just the dangerous area, but also avoid what seemed to be a more coordinated search. As Hank saw the lights, he started creating a strategy in the distance, one that would need precise timing and a good deal of luck to succeed. Dawn arrived with a spooky silence following the storm, and the air was thick with fog. With the smell of damp earth, Hank stood at the mouth of the cave, examining the altered terrain. The valley below had turned into a labyrinth of muddy slopes and swollen streams before he arrived. Because of the persistent clouds covering the neighboring peaks, every aspect of their escape path would require to be re-examined, but they were unable to wait much longer after Hank noticed additional searchlights while on his night watch. traveling in systematic ways that indicated the Wildlife Conservation Board had reportedly summoned more resources, and he could tell from the sporadic radio conversations that they were getting closer to where they were. So he whispered to Rose, "Time to move, girl." Was already awake, and the cubs, still exhausted from yesterday's trauma, stirred as they watched him. Especially appeared hesitant to leave the protection of the cave, yet his eyes had that recognizable resolve that had come to signify a great deal to Hank, and their first obstacle was traversing the valley, which had turned into a network of rushing water. The primary stream had divided into a network of rushing water and unstable terrain. Hank Leds used many channels to create a sequence of perilous crossings, thoroughly testing each stage before enabling the bears to follow the male bears, whose footprints could still be seen in areas that led away from their location. Hank took advantage of this by purposefully stepping on these tracks whenever they could, resulting in they had reached halfway over a bewildering route that would be challenging for even seasoned trackers to understand. The morning silence was abruptly broken by the sound of an incoming helicopter in the valley. Rose, as Hank braced himself against a rocky crag, she led her cubs into a thicket of foliage. Flew low overhead, its occupants evidently using advanced equipment to survey the ground as quickly as possible. They continued, but the event had left them all tense. Even Buck, who normally preferred to pave his own way, remained uncommonly close to their mother. But Tommy appeared to have discovered a new strength in the crisis, keeping up with his siblings with a firmness that made Hank's heart want to burst with pride. Their progress was painfully slow, with each stride making their chests swell with pride. Thoughtfully selected to prevent leaving noticeable traces, Hank employed every tactic he had acquired over the years as a wilderness guide, using fallen planks to cross rocks, while utilizing natural features that would not contain prints, although total concealment was hard because of the wet ground. They arrived at the foot of the last ridge separating them from their target, the hidden valley, by mid-morning, just on the opposite side, offering sanctuary's isolated setting and plenty of resources. But arriving means starting their ascent, Hank, by ascending an almost vertical slope that had been turned slick and unstable by the recent storm. Heard dogs barking considerably closer than before, which made his heart rush. Despite his efforts, search teams had located their trail, and he could see movement in the valley below as he looked back. "There are other squads gathered at their position, so we must move quickly," he said. Rose appeared to understand the need, urging her even though he understood that haste would make their climb more hazardous. With Hank assisting the cubs, the climb turned into a haze of frantic scurrying as the cubs advanced with mild prods. Over most challenging portions, continuously monitoring their perilous progress, they were 3/4 of the tiniest cub lost his footing on the damp pebbles far up when Tommy slipped, tumbling several feet before Hank's heart rose growled in despair as he almost stopped. But he managed to catch himself on a narrow ledge. However, she was unable to get to her cub without endangering her other 2 kids, so Hank proceeded cautiously. The ledge was just barely wide enough for the little cub to fit Tommy's position, and one mistake could send them both falling. They were running out of time. "So trust me, little Hank," as the sounds below came closer down the slope. "Hunchy," he said, reaching out a hand to the quivering cub Tommy, who gazed at him with those perceptive eyes that had first won Hank's affection months ago. And for a brief instant, everything else vanished. The chase, the peril, the impossible circumstance they found themselves in. It was only an understanding that moved eyes from Kimmy to Bob until it finally found Kimmy to the house. Tommy made a little noise, and the bear was bound by something more profound than nature intended. Almost whined, he rubbed himself into Hank's arm with such tenderness that Hank assisted the cub in finding safety. The relief in the mother bear's eyes as she led him back to the main road, where Rose and the others were waiting, was obvious, and Hank experienced a deep connection that went beyond species. But their moment of triumph was brief, because the noises of the pursuit were approaching perilously, and they still had the last part of 300 feet above the ground, the ridge to traverse. The summit seemed enticingly close, them safely waiting on the opposite side. But this final 100 feet would be the most vulnerable and hazardous area of Rose. As they got ready for the last push of their journey, Hank made a choice. That would alter everything. He was aware of what he needed to do, despite the fact that it would jeopardize his own future. At Rose and her cubs, Tommy's dependable eyes, Star's inquisitive stare, and Buck's resolute posture, knowing that the hidden valley was waiting for them yet, to secure their escape, Hank would first need to make one more desperate gamble while standing on the edge of his island. His last gamble would be Hank getting down from the truck. He would look at where Hank was standing, and sometimes still does, when it rains, met him with a trust that had been gained over the course of months of the cubs' care and protection, but resolutely cuddled near their mother at that very moment. Hank understood exactly what he involved. Quick, rehearsed motions. So he took off his outer jacket and started. His scent would be sufficiently carried by the jacket to create a false trail that went away from the bears of position. Draw the tracking dogs. Then he took his emergency flare and went to a location. He said, "Set it off the bright red light cutting through the morning mist. Go," around 50 yards from the bears. The mother bear hesitated before saying, "I'll lead them away," to Rose, pointing to the summit. Briefly, as though realizing the sacrifice he was making, then, she started guiding her cubs up the last hill, using the survival instinct that had led her species for millennia. Search crews reacted to the flare as Hank had intended, shouting and barking as they stretched toward freedom. Through openings in the mist, he could see one of their dogs converged on his position, away from the bear's escape route. His voice carried above him as uniformed figures up the slope, following his purposefully visible trail. "We understand that you're attempting to protect the others, Hank, but this has gone too far." Hank was unable to respond to his old friend's sincere worry. Instead of making a noise that might reveal the bear's location, he proceeded to move laterally over the slope. While lying, Hank observed further fictitious trails by carefully looking over his shoulder. Tommy demonstrates strength that would have seemed unthinkable months ago as Rose and her cubs make steady progress toward the peak. The sight of him keeping up with his siblings warmed Hank's heart with pride, and the pursuit team was getting closer to his location when a loud roar resounded, bringing with it the bittersweet joy that they would make it. The male bear had reappeared on a ridge above the search group on the opposite side of the mountain. Presence temporarily threw the teams into disarray, allowing Rose and her cubs to eventually gain valuable extra seconds. Rose and her cubs, for whom Hank had been praying, crested the peak in the swirling mist, and they stopped there, briefly appeared as a silhouette against the rising sky before vanishing across the other side in the direction of the hidden valley that would provide them with food, shelter, and, most crucially, freedom from human interference. Hank halted his sprint and stood erect as the search crews approached him. Mrs. Chen from the Wildlife Conservation Board was also present, her immaculate business suit now muddy, with Mike at their head. "And disheveled the bears?" Mike inquired. Hank merely made a hazy gesture in the wrong direction. He spoke in a firm, carrying voice as they headed into the wilderness, where they belonged. To his astonishment, Mrs. Chen came forward with an assurance that he had done the right thing. "Surprising grin, Mr. Bennett. Your commitment to these bears has been illuminating. Perhaps we've been going about this completely incorrectly. Rather than catching and analyzing them, perhaps we ought to be studying under those like you who comprehend the actual significance of conservation in the future." A few hours went by in a haze of discussions and clarifications, and Hank's standing as an authority on the wilderness, coupled with his evident dedication to protecting wildlife, resulted in him being offered a job as a conservation advisor who helped create guidelines rather than facing penalties. For wildlife viewing that honors the animal's innate tendencies and requires the hidden valley, where Rose and her cubs discovered that sanctuary was a protected region that was off limits to regular human access and development. Only a small amount of closely supervised research would be permitted, and even then, only from a safe distance. Months after disturbing the bears, Hank looked at the window of his cabin and observed a sunset. As the mountains were painted in dazzling hues by the summer sunset, his life took unexpected turns while he was still cherishes solitude. He had discovered a new calling in imparting his expertise and enthusiasm for animal conservation to others. On occasion, while he was near the hidden valley on business, he would sight of a mother bear, 3 developing cubs, and a familiar family. Though he was a little smaller than the others, he confidently walked through their mountain home without ever approaching them, never made an effort to re-establish the link they had formed during those trying months, some of which he discovered were intended to be brief, yet have an enduring influence. Tommy and his family had imparted to Hank valuable knowledge regarding the great ring of protection. The real meaning of protection is that sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love. In exchange for giving him another opportunity at purpose, the mountains made sure that a tiny bit of real wilderness would still be wilderness where bears could live without human intrusion and raise their young as nature intended. Hank grinned as the last of the sunshine disappeared from the peaks, knowing that somewhere a bear family was flourishing in those mountains, and his heart was at peace. Had he turned his back on that path before pursuing his calling, he probably would have stopped there. Tranquility infused with the quiet fulfillment of changing the world, one unmarried family at a time. And so the bears maintained their independence and mountains their secrets. But one man's people's passion for the wilderness kept motivating them to preserve the fragile equilibrium between human development and cybernetics, using the principle of compatible multiplication. In the end, environmental preservation was more than simply a bear rescue tale. It was about having the guts to stand up for what's right and finding purpose and hope, even if it appears that there is no way forward in the gathering dusk as the stars start to rise above the mountain peaks. Hank's choice's legacy endured in all free creatures that called these mountains home, which is evidence of the enduring strength of bravery and compassion, as well as the unbreakable ties that bind all living. Dear listeners, we sincerely hope that Hank Bennett's tale and his remarkable YA have been moved to continue this poignant journey through the world of Rose and her cubs. We have created a unique playlist of equally intriguing stories about nature and conservation, which you can listen to here via button on your left. If this tale resonated with you, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Every day, we provide original tales that delve into the intricacies of life and the splendor of nature. Miss our next content? Leave a comment with your personal tales of connecting with nature.